This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covell. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I'm calling this episode today the State episode. State power, central planning. That's where it's at. Well, not exactly. My two guests today love taking stabs at the state. First, Doug Casey of Casey Research. Been around forever. A really interesting take on things, an interesting way of thinking. My second guest today is Charles Hughes Smith. I'm not sure how I found Charles originally, but his blog, of2minds.com, is awesome. Beyond taking stabs at the state, Charles also drives the dagger into the idea of a standard issue job. Very much the entrepreneur, very much about sustainability. Both guests today, right there in the same headspace, challenging the audience to question the state. I hope you enjoy. You are a man of travel. I definitely have not had a chance to have anyone on my podcast yet. I'm well over 250 episodes. I know no one has traveled to 175 countries. And I think you've lived in 10 to 12 countries. My big picture question for you right out of the gate, which I think will set the tone. Doug, where can I find social and economic liberty today in this world?
I'm afraid there's not any place that you can go. But I think it could have been Thomas Paine that 200 years ago that liberty has been banished from all the shores of the world. So maybe it always seems that way, but I think it's much more so that way today because all of these governments all over the world are working together in these various clubs they belong to, the UN, the OECD, the EC. There's so many of them, Mercosur in South America, where they're exchanging information and cooperating with each other, and inures to the disadvantage of individuals. So I'm afraid that there is no actual Shangri-La. That said, there are some places that are much better than others for various things. No place I can think of is better in every way for everything.
Let me let you offer some specifics. Let's talk economic liberty. Where would you say you find the most comfort for economic liberty?
The first thing to bear in mind is not to live in the country where you're a citizen or supposedly a permanent resident, because most countries of the world reserve the right to tax you, your income, on a worldwide income. Not all of them. I mean, like I spent a lot of time in Uruguay. Uruguay only taxes you on domestic income. But most countries tax you on worldwide income if you live there more than 6 months of the year. And there are usually other things if you live there over 6 months of the year. So you can't live in any place more than 6 months of the year. And that makes a lot of sense from other points of view, too, because the weather's usually better someplace other times of the year. You get stale if you just stay in one place. You can increase your liberty most by being to some degree a PT, a perpetual tourist. Mm. I put that number one on the list of how you can increase your freedom, because the thing is that if you're officially a tourist someplace, then you're an honored guest that has to be courted, that they hope will spend money they'll go in the pockets of the locals. But once you're a citizen, you're a milk cow. So your status changes. So that's number one. But that said, there's some places that I definitely like better than others in the world.
Well, I know you're fond of Argentina, yeah?
I am, and Argentina gets terrible press, and it's justifiable, because when you go into the government in Argentina, it's to steal. That's exactly what the institution of government serves. It's a way to get rich. Any president of Argentina, or for that matter, any provincial governor expects to get out of office as a billionaire. So that's not good about Argentina. But once you're outside of Buenos Aires, which is a delightful city itself, I really like BA. Once you're out into the provinces where there are no people, I mean, there's only 40 million people in Argentina, and it's the 8th largest country in the world. And almost all those people are in and around BA. So the country's empty once you're outside. So they leave you alone. I chose Argentina by process of elimination out of all the countries in the world, adding things up. And I'm happy with that choice. And I ruled out North America. Central America has no class. If I wanted to make a whole bunch of money, and I was 30 years younger, I'd definitely go to Africa. No questions about that. Africa's the place to be. For some elements of lifestyle, you're in the Orient now, as I was speaking. The Orient would be great. I enjoy it a lot. Actually, Thailand was going to be my second choice, which is totally different. It's like the antipodes geographically and socially from Argentina. But Argentina's it, certainly among all the countries in South America, from my point of view.
Listen, let me jump into some heavier stuff. I love the fact that you describe yourself as an anarchist. And you know, maybe 15 years ago, I wouldn't have had enough common sense to say that. But today, you know, clearly in America, at least, you can pick a party on the right, you can pick a party on the left. Those don't take you anywhere. Just saying one is a libertarian, I'm not really sure that takes one anywhere. But saying you're an anarchist, that really just grabs it by the cojones, doesn't it?
Well, when I'm talking to, when I give a speech, you've got to get the offer. Well, there's several reasons. First of all, because it's absolutely true in my case. Announcing yourself as such kind of hits the audience between the eyes with a 2x4, and it gets their attention, because they always think of anarchists as being violent and carrying little round bombs with a fuse lit and a black cape and this type of. This is complete nonsense. An anarchist is simply one that does not believe in the rule of the state, and I don't think the state serves a useful purpose. Just as in Argentina, all over the world, it's just a vehicle for theft for the people that get into it. And it's the lowest and worst of humanity that want to become members of the state, not the best and the brightest. So, no, it's a philosophical position that I adhere to, and it's also a practical position that I adhere to. I don't understand why all these silly chimpanzees think that they need a ruler to lord it over them.
Hey, but look, the state is ascendant, as I've seen you say. I mean, it's the centerpiece of society. So if we take these anarchist positions, we're definitely a minority, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And because of the fact there have been violent anarchists in the past, and I've got to point out that these are all socialists that call themselves anarchists, which is very inappropriate for a socialist to do, because if you're going to have socialism, you've got to have organized coercion. You've got to have the state. So I've never understood, and I love the rhetoric of some European anarchists, like especially Bakunin and Kropotkin, who called themselves anarchists. But they were quite wrong to say that. If you're going to be a socialist, you need the state, and they were socialists. Anyway, it's illegal to be an anarchist in many countries around the world today, so you have to be a little bit careful with that, because during the violent days of these European anarchists, people thought they're like communists or jihadists, if you wish, but we're not. Anarchism is is the kindest and gentlest of all philosophies. It's, I call it the watercourse way that allows things to settle to their own level.
You know, because on the flip side, the state, I think it's fair to say that the state attracts people that enjoy putting force upon others. And that's not a pretty picture.
It's not, and you're quite correct, actually. One way I look at it, there are two ways. There are two kinds of people in the world. There's people that want to control things and physical reality, and that's admirable. That's how you get progress, by molding the world to what you'd like. And then there's another kind of person that is not too good at that or too interested in that, but he wants to control other people. And that's the kind of person that goes into politics. So that anybody that's attracted to politics is a professional busybody. He wants to control other people. And I'd go so far as to say that they tend to be criminal personalities. It's a sad testimony to human beings, their present state of evolution, and generally that they actually vote for these people and support them and give them money. I mean, maybe they're just getting what they deserve. Half of the people in the U.S. vote. I mean, I can't have any sympathy for them.
And I've seen you make the comment that you don't necessarily have a loyalty to your fellow Americans. And you make the argument, hold on, it's an accident of birth that I'm here. And you go further to say that, look, America is an ideal. It's not a place. And so from that sense, why should, if one is born in America, should we just unilaterally have loyalty to our fellow Americans? Shouldn't we have loyalty to the people that have the same morals, ethics, understandings that we do? Just the unilateral loyalty, I've never understood that.
No, and I don't understand it either. This whole idea that you've got to, be loyal to this completely arbitrary tribe that you have no relationship with, genetically or even linguistically. I mean, I don't speak the same language as half the other people in the United States. Like you said, I'm loyal to people that share my values and my ideals, and I don't care if they live in the middle of the Congo, or if they live in Cambodia or France or anywhere.
I want to go into some financial topics. And I know you believe that at some point there will be a financial panic. You think it'll happen. And even if someone out there disagrees and says, Doug's being a doom and gloomer or this or that, the idea that somebody could unilaterally rule out the idea of a financial panic, given all the events we've seen, really starting the summer of 2007, to rule out a financial panic, that to me seems like the definition of insanity. To just rule it out and say it can't happen, which again just leaves you trusting the state to take care of you.
Yes, it's interesting because, as I said, during the northern summer, I've for a long time been here in Aspen. Most of the people I associate with they're rich guys, quite frankly. And I went out for my Monday night poker game with a bunch of these guys last night. And I was asking one of them, who was an old friend that I had dinner with beforehand, I said, Ron, what do most of these people think about my gloomy views on the economy? I mean, do they resent it? Do they dislike it? And he says, no, they just don't believe you. And that's true. Most people think that, because things have gotten kind of better, even over the last 30, 40 years, at least for them, because they're the rich guys, they don't think things are going to change. They think America's America. It's not. It's just the United States. It's just another country at this point. But I'll go further than say a panic. I'd say that since 2007, we've entered a depression, and I define a depression as a period of time during which most people's standard of living drops significantly. I think that's a fact. Since 1971, it's been slow. It's been a slow motion type of thing. It takes a long time for an economic ship as big as the United States to sink. In 1971, there was still a book out there called Europe on $5 a day. And it was a realistic book. And you weren't living like a hippie on $5 a day. You could live like a middle-class person. I know it sounds absurd today, but today, most places in the world, I've got to say, I hate to say most, but I think it may be most places in the world are actually more expensive than the United States. And that means that most foreigners today, at least in advanced countries, have more net wealth and a higher standard of living than Americans do. And most of the high standard of living that Americans have is financed by debt. It should be financed by savings, not debt.
You know, I think for most people, if they hear the phrase QE, still to this day, the average person probably scratches their head. Even a doctor, attorney, somebody with money in the bank, they hear the term QE, they really don't know what it means. They know that they don't get interest income anymore. They understand the idea of zero interest. Perhaps they don't complain because they see stocks at all-time highs and they feel like, you know, they have to be quiet because that's just the way it is. But what is QE really for the average person? I mean, if you were to tell the average person, what is QE? Once we get past the monikers and all that kind of fun stuff, what is it effectively? It's a currency debasement, isn't it?
Yes, it's money printing. That's literally what it is. Where every month at this particular point, I don't know how much they're printing every month, $45 billion a month of new currency is being created by the Federal Reserve, by buying mortgage securities, by buying U.S. government treasuries. And when the Federal Reserve buys these securities, they credit the account of the seller with that many Federal Reserve notes in a commercial bank. And then they can sell it, then they can, spend those things in the market. And you increase the supply of currency, each subsequent unit of currency drops in value. But it's worse than that, because it gets to some people's hands before others, and they can spend it at the old value. It's the rich people that are benefiting from this, because everybody knows today. I mean, it's like a meme that's circulating, but a correct one. It's the top 1%, the top 1/10% that are becoming extraordinarily wealthy, and the average guy can't even pay his mortgage, can't pay his food bill. There's 50 million people collecting food stamps in this country. So it benefits the rich. It hurts the poor. It hurts the savers, which are people that are prudent, that produce more than they consume and try to set aside the difference, but they set it aside in dollars, and the dollar's a hot potato because of all this money printing. And at some point, it's not just going to be mild inflation. Right now they say it's 2%. This is baloney. It's really close to 10%. They fudge the figures in the United States just the way they do in Argentina. In Argentina, they say it's 10%. It's actually 30%. Well, but anyway, that's what Q is. It's a disaster.
How, as a man who's traveled to 175 countries and territories, how did you start that process? Was there an influence early on in life that said, I am going to be this global traveler? What started that in you? I mean, that's something I think most people hear and say, I'm never going to do that. And maybe you didn't think you were going to do it when you started it. What was the trigger?
I didn't actually try to do it. I mean, I wanted to increase my experience in the world. One of the few beneficial things, in relative terms, of going to college is I spent my junior year abroad in Switzerland. So I traveled throughout most of Europe during that year, the way college kids might do. Came back to the U.S., and I started just taking trips. I took a trip to Iceland. It was cheap, thought it was interesting, spent a week there. Took a trip to Senegal. It was cheap, never been there. And then I got into one thing or another, a bunch of countries I just traveled around like that. And then I got into the mining business, the mining finance business. It became incumbent upon me to visit the mine sites, and they're usually in obscure places in the world, and that added to things. So, one thing after another, there was really no intention. Like some of these people, they say, I want to visit every country in the world. Well, that's pointless. You go to a country, you spend a day there. I mean, it doesn't really serve much of a useful purpose. So I don't know. At this point, I'm traveling less, quite frankly, because it's kind of like a been there, done that. I got to have a particular reason for going someplace. But I recommend it to everybody. It broadens the horizons. You see opportunities that you absolutely will not see if you stay in one place. I recommend that everybody do that. Stop acting like a medieval serf where you're married to the earth that you were born on.
I love that. I love that. Hey, Doug, listen, best place for people to go and check out your world, caseyresearch.com?
Yes.
Thank you for taking the time. Hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Okay, yeah, it was my pleasure. Absolutely.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.
Now for my second interview with Charles Hugh Smith.
I want to lay the kind of foundation from where you're coming from. Some people are going to be familiar with your work. Some won't be, and they'll like it after we finish our conversation. I want to read a quick excerpt that I think gets right into the heart of your perspective. And I think what I really love about your work is you take complicated subjects and bring them down a notch and try, clearly I can see this as an author, you're trying to use as few of words as possible to make your point. Let me read this really quick. By eliminating the economy's immune system, central planning dramatically increases vulnerability and guarantees systemic crises down the road. Another way of understanding the destruction wrought by central planning is to see central planners as heroin pushers who addict the economy to zero interest rate credit and constant flow of free money to the winners selected by the central bank/state. Well, I think the key thing for me reading that passage, and maybe for the average person out there, maybe he or she is their 50s, 60s, 70s. Maybe they're approaching retirement. They've got a decent job. And, they've seen these two bubbles burst in the last 15 years. And now we've got a situation where stocks have risen greatly. And perhaps for the average person, they really don't know why. They've probably got an uneasy feeling. But I think the key thing that you say there is the constant flow of free money directed to winners selected by the state. Now you're taking a fairly complicated thing that's taking place that most people don't understand and reducing it to 15 words. Why don't you elaborate the idea that winners are being selected by the state?
Well, Michael, that's a big topic, but let's see if we can compress it down by using an example most people are familiar with, which was the too big to fail banks that were bailed out in the 2008 global financial crisis. And I think that's a pretty good example of the state picking winners. In a diversified economy without central planning, then what happens is businesses that take on too much risk and too much debt, too much leverage, they're making big bets, big risky bets. Well, when those bets go bad, then those businesses are go bankrupt and are dissolved and their assets sold off, and what's left is given to the creditors. So what we had in 2008 was a situation just like that private enterprises had made really large leveraged bets that housing would never go down and similar kinds of bets. And those bets went south. And in a economy that's not centrally planned, then those businesses would have been allowed to fail. They would have gone broke and their assets sold off, and that's the end of them. And whatever business they were in would be taken over by other companies that had not made such risky bets. And so instead, the state, which is the term we use in political science for the government or the central government, the state decided not to let that happen. It intervened and saved those banks and is in fact still saving those banks, because part of why interest rates have to be zero is so that the banks get money for basically free that they can then loan to us, and their margins of profit are immense. And that's the direct result of the state intervening in the economy to pick the winners, in the winners in this case are the super large banks.
Charles, we all grow up with this idea that America is this special place economically, and that as an American you can reach down, pull your bootstraps up, and go to work and make something happen, and that there's a certain fairness and merit counts and you work hard. But what does it say about our system that right when unless you were a special friend, that right when certain private operations, for example, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, there's others, should have been bankrupt, should no longer exist. What does it say, though, that when they're saved? Because we can talk about those particular instances. What worries me is the future, because you don't know who's going to pick and choose, and the game just feels rigged.
Michael, that's an excellent point, because that's sort of the second half of this discussion we're having on the state picking winners. Is we ask, well, who picks the winners, and how do they decide who to pick? And of course, the answer is, if you can get the government to protect your business, then there's a variety of ways of doing so. No bid contracts, special regulations that eliminate all your competition because only you have enough financial wealth to meet these regulatory rules that the government's imposing on the industry. So there's a lot of ways that the state can pick winners, sort of inobtrusively or under the cover of what appears to be regulations that are sold as protecting the public. And so you go, well, how do you do that? And of course, the answer is, if you make enough money, like for instance, the large banks just were scooping, tens of billions of dollars in profits, then you can buy political influence and then get the state to protect you and your enterprise and eliminate or restrict competition that could threaten your profits. And so this is the unholy alliance between the corporation and the state, because they're actually, in my mind, one system. And people look at that and go, well, wait a minute, this is private enterprise and this is, public money. But if you and I have $100 billion in assets and we can spend $1 billion buying political influence through lobbying and campaign contributions, we can easily get regulations that favor us for what appears from our point of view to be a relatively modest sum of money. We can buy a lot of political influence for $10 million. Well, that's nothing to us. We could even spend $100 million, and that's still much cheaper than an advertising campaign.
Charles, do you think that there would be some public uproar if equity markets in the U.S., for example, were not at all-time highs and were perhaps below 10,000 on the Dow? Would there be the possibility that if the equity market, what I like to refer to as a bribe, if the equity market bribe, and the funny thing is that I don't know how anybody imagines, how a lot in the audience might imagine that if you are long only and that's your strategy to trust the Fed, how everybody thinks they're all going to get out at the exact same time when a bubble pops, when another bubble pops. I'm not making a prediction. I'm just asking for how people are going to actually do this. But it seems like to me that if the markets weren't at all-time highs, that maybe there'd be an uproar. But it seems like once people are kind of paid off, everyone just goes along with the show.
That's an excellent observation, Michael, and I've spoken about this using the word complicity, but I think your word bribe is actually better. And that we're all bribed to go along with this because the equity market floats a lot of pensions, both state, local government pensions, private pensions, 401ks, IRAs, everybody has a huge stake in the system being held or lofted to all new highs all the time, because they're looking at their own accounts and going, gosh, if this thing crashes, my retirement's toast. And they don't want that to happen. And so that's how we've all gone along with the state picking winners, because if it picks winners such that the stock market keeps going higher and real estate keeps going higher, then everybody who owns those assets feels like they're winning. And therefore, whatever rules are broken or what's been eroded is of less concern to them than their own account balance, if you will. But that's rather short-sighted, because the system is becoming more and more unstable on a systemic level by all this intervention. As you sort of suggested, when you distort the system so completely, at some point it breaks down, regardless of further intervention.
Let me give an example for a question, a rhetorical question, something you had posed, and I'll pose it to you. What happens, and the audience should think about this, what happens when the typical wage earner can no longer substitute debt, i.e. credit card, for earned income to sustain their consumption. What happens when that breaks?
We can throw in another factor, which is we all know about, which is higher costs, and especially higher energy costs, because those will float through the entire system. You know, that energy is the basis of not just gasoline, and transport, but food. You know, all the food in the United States is grown with huge amounts of energy. All the water that's pumped is, you know, energy. I mean, energy is the cost basis of our entire culture and economy. So energy's basically doubled in price if you look at the price of cost per barrel of oil. And so those costs go up and wages are stagnant. And so the system has adapted to that by saying, well, let's just drop interest rates to near zero so that all the people with debt can now afford more debt. But that game has sort of run its course. In other words, now that interest rates are zero, the Federal Reserve and other central banks can't really do any more. And so that's when we're coming to the breaking point. As costs keep edging higher, wages are stagnant, there's no more slack in the system in terms of, well, let's just lower the cost of interest. So people will have to spend less and consume less. And in a society that's based on growth of consumption, that means the system has to fall into recession or worse.
Let's break something apart, because I think one of the things you do so effectively on your site at Of Two Minds is you don't come across as an economist. You come across as somebody who really lays out scenarios. Let's talk about wages being stagnant. Let's break that apart, because I think sometimes when I hear mainstream economists talk, they act like, you know, everything's in a vacuum. You talk about employment and comparing it to 30 or 40 years ago, before the advent of technology arbing away jobs, before the advent of China taking every manufacturing job. So wages stagnant is a pretty big concept. There's a lot behind that.
Yes. And we can start with two concepts which are pretty well established in both economic theory and also in what we can see ourselves. One of them is a lot of work is tradable. That's what they call it. And what tradable means is obviously it can be done somewhere else. It's a kind of a commodity. And so when we say that labor has been commoditized, what we mean is that the people who are making the thing in a factory, it doesn't matter really to the end user or the corporation or the government. It doesn't matter to anybody if it's made in Ireland, Thailand, Bulgaria, the U.S., doesn't matter. And so that kind of work, of course, is exposed to a lot of competitive pressure, because if a company can move a factory to a place with very low labor costs, then they're going to profit more, and so that makes sense to them. And so in the United States, that means that manufacturing in particular has been exposed to the commoditization of labor. You know, that tradable labor has gone overseas, and we can bemoan that, but we have to understand the incentives are built in for that to happen. The other thing that's happening, Michael, is process-based work is being replaced by software and robotics. And by that, I mean anything that can be broken down into little steps that can be programmed. The U.S. adjusted to the loss of manufacturing labor, due to software, robotics, and globalization in the 70s. And that was sort of the general basis, along with the cost of oil going up, for the stagnation of that decade. Well, now all those same trends are hitting the service industry, which is 70% of the U.S. economy. And so now it's not just a factory worker who's being replaced, but it's an insurance agent, it's a teller, it's a person working in fast food. It's like most of the U.S. economy is now vulnerable to these same competitive forces. So kind of beneath the surface, there's these two huge systemic forces pushing labor costs down for the majority of workers. And so that's the source of stagnation. And people want to fix this problem by raising the minimum wage and all these kinds of proposals, and raising taxes on wealthy so it can be redistributed to people who aren't doing so well. And these are all sort of fixes, but they're surface fixes. They're not really addressing the problem, which is if you want to create more income, you have to create more value and solve more problems. And so just sort of playing within the existing circle of problems and solutions and fixes isn't really going to solve anything. We need to move beyond that and realize we're in a whole new era of work.
You know, I find interesting too is that it used to be, at least I like to think growing up as a man in my 40s, there used to be a certain cowboy spirit to America. And now we have this spirit of take care of us. It's helpless. And I don't think, regardless of whether one's an American or not, I don't think the average human being is built biologically to just want to be taken care of. People want the sense of making something happen. They want to do something themselves. I mean, I've read reports about the difference between telling a woman that she's smart or beautiful and how her behavior will change. And I think it's very similar in the sense that people don't just want to be taken care of, and we've kind of gone backwards, and where instead of trusting that maybe a certain segment of the population that isn't as doing as well, instead of just giving them everything, maybe what they really need is some insight. Listen, if you want to get ahead, you got to be careful, because if you take all the goodies, you're just going to get addicted to the goodies, and you'll never learn that lesson about making something happen, which I think probably dives back into your book, Get a Job, Build a Real Career.
Yeah. And Michael, I think you've touched on something that for some reason is considered not politically correct or something. It's almost verboten to speak about the loss of meaning and purpose when people are just sort of shunted aside and said, well, here's a check, just stay at home and watch TV or play on the internet. And all humans, as you say, are drawn to a life which has purpose and meaning. And in the sort of traditional societies, that's built around a community that's productive. In other words, you're not just doing nothing. People are either taking care of kids, or they're tending the fields, or they're hunting, or they're doing something that benefits the community or their household. And so what we've done is by separating out, you're either working and you have an income, or you're sort of been thrown on the trash heap, then we're really denying people the opportunity to have meaning and purpose. And so it's going to require a massive change in our value system and our economy to say, well, we're going to provide an opportunity for meaning and purpose to everyone, rather than just give people, free housing, free money, and free food. That this is not a sustainable thing, and not good for the people who are receiving it.
But Charles, let me come back at you on that and say there's really nothing on the horizon yet that says the trend line to take care of more and more people. And I'm not trying to be some kind of, I'm not being sympathetic to the plight of folks that aren't doing as well. But I just think it's gross to addict. I mean, look, you talk about a lot of different subjects on your blog. Obesity in America. I mean, it's terrible. It's terrible. So, I mean, all these things we know don't work, and we just keep doing them. And I just wonder, you seem to be making the case there for a second that, maybe we'll all get wise and there's going to be a policy prescription to fix it all. I kind of just keep thinking the train's going to keep running full steam ahead until it hits a wall. I don't know what that wall is going to be and when it's going to happen. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Michael. And I think for me, the solution is not to look for a policy from the central government, because that's just another form of central planning. Another set of winners will be picked, and then everyone else will be the losers. And I think we can see that whole idea of imposing some solution on people, that's not going to work. And so the alternative solution is to build a whole different kind of economy from the ground up, if you will. And we see a lot of activity in this way. In other words, what I call the community economy, which is like the part of the economy that's not controlled by the state and it's not controlled by global corporations. And so examples are like farmers markets, credit unions, Airbnb, peer-to-peer services. There's this whole wealth of open source ideas and opportunities that are arising without the state being able to pick winners and losers. And of course, this is freaking out those in power, because it's like they want to maintain control over everything, because that's the ultimate goal of power. But despite their best efforts to regulate away these kinds of open source, self-organizing networks, they're happening anyway. And so I think that that's probably the model for the future that's positive, is the parts of the economy and society that aren't controlled by the state.
So if you're a young person today, maybe someone who's a teenager, 20s, 30s, building your life around non-state controlled opportunities, would you just go all in and say, I'm going to get outside the state purview right now because I'm looking ahead decades, and I just like the freedom and the sense of purpose it gives me to be outside the state system, state apparatus, so to speak, or as much as you can be?
Right, exactly. And I think that it's like lessening dependence, as you say, which we can think of it like an addiction, or we can just think of it as a dysfunctional dependence. Or the other side is self-reliance. And, people want security. That's another built-in human desire. And so what we've been trained to think by the state is, if you depend on the state, you have security, because the government can always just print money to send to you. But there are side effects to that, and that's not really a sustainable system, just to print money or pick winners. And so that the security that the state offers is actually illusory, because as we've discussed, when these things start breaking down, then what you were promised turns out to be impossible to deliver. And so, from my point of view, security comes from having a network, having skills that make you self-reliant, having a variety of income sources. And I mean, this is like security that you control, as opposed to security that the state is promising and making empty promises about. So that's kind of my focus in terms of practical advice.
I'm sure there's some people out there that are probably saying, hey, Mike, and I know you're not a negative guy. Your writing is not negative, even though some of these topics we're talking about are heavy. And I'm sure some people in the audience could possibly be saying, oh, these two guys, they're just getting all doom and gloom. Aren't they happy that their real estate prices are higher now? Aren't they happy that the stock market's higher now? And I find it interesting that in terms of a national discussion, international discussion, that no one examines past history. It's like there is so much of the population is so fixated on where we are right now, and however we got there is irrelevant.
Yeah, and I think you could say the same thing about an understanding of how systems work. And the reason why I bring up the idea of a system or a structure is we can look back at history, as you say, and we can see certain patterns that take decades to play out. For instance, a lot of people have commented recently on the rise of social instability and the cost of food. And that when the average cost of food exceeds around 40% of the household budget, you start getting demonstrations, you get social unrest, you get governments overthrown, and all these things happen. And of course, those are correlated. And so in another way, we can look at the kind of system we're discussing, where the government picks a handful of winners and it prints money with abandon and makes interest rates zero. There are side effects to that will kick in and will bring the system down. And that's another lesson from history we can draw. We seem to be lacking like the conceptual basis to move beyond a system that is not sustainable.
And I think one of the things that you target in your work is, and we've mentioned it some already, is the decentralization of power and wealth. To try and get away from, because I think sometimes, even for people that are well versed in this, the idea, saying central planning, it's kind of like, they think, well, maybe Charles and Mike are straight out of libertarian central casting or something. But, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and I really don't think a good number of Americans truly understand the power that's wielded from that area. I mean, I still own property in Northern Virginia, and the property in Northern Virginia is not at sky-high record prices because there's a tremendous number of capitalists in the Northern Virginia area. That's not the reason. It's because the machine, the apparatus all lives there. They're all paid great salaries, and they have tentacles that reach out from the home base there in D.C., and they just reach into every aspect of life. And it's like we're lobsters being boiled in a coal pot. No one seems to mind all of this control and bureaucracy. And have we lost our minds, Charles?
Well, part of it may be that people feel powerless to change, and you probably get a lot of this feedback from your listeners. Is everybody senses that, say, there's basically 6 corporations that run the entire media. I mean, there's a huge centralization of power. There's like a half dozen banks that own most of the mortgages. There's a few government agencies that control the whole financial sector. This kind of incredible centralization, it feeds on itself, as we said, because once you have that kind of centralization, then you can bribe the government to protect your industry and protect your centralization. But I think the solution, if you will, is bursting out of the seams. If you want to use some sort of analogy, in that the internet and technology is showing that we can bypass these centralized things. For instance, the banks. Well, frankly, the technology already exists to get rid of the large banks. It can all be done online. If you want to find a mortgage, you can do that online. You don't even need a bank or a banker anymore. If you want to invest your money, then you can find these crowdsourced opportunities and do your own due diligence, and you don't even need a bank. And the idea that we don't need these gigantic agencies from the state controlling everything, or we don't need these global corporations, that's a striking thought. And I don't think you're going to get rid of those corporations or the state, but I think the idea is to just work around them.
I think it's interesting, too, is that so many of these big corporations you're talking about, okay, the average person goes in, shops there, gives them their money. They're kind of just constantly skimming and taking money from the average population. Then that same person goes ahead, gives their money to the big corporation, part of the oligopoly, and then their pension, if they're a public employee, gets invested in those same companies. It's this weird circle of life that exists right now, and no one pays attention. That's why I want to have you on. You're paying attention.
Yeah, and paying attention creates anxiety in a lot of people, because they don't, in a way, they either don't want to know or they don't want to focus on something over which they have no control. But I think they might be missing the point that we all make decisions and vote every day. Every dollar or yuan or euro we spend every day is a vote. And so if you take your money away from the too big to fail banks, from the 6 media companies, from these centralized forces, you can place your vote somewhere else. And every hour that you devote to watching Dancing with the Stars or whatever sort of media distraction you might have, you could take your vote away from that and invest that hour of time in yourself, and there's a whole model for this in Japan, and we both know that Japan's been stagnating for 20 years. And it's like the United States, and on the surface, everything seems to be fine, but underneath, it's all rotting. It's all eroding. The young people don't have the same opportunity. The lifetime employment thing is toast. A lot of people are living on part-time jobs. They're not able to reach their potential. And so we can look at some models coming out of Japan, one of which I like is called half farmer, half X. And we go, what's that mean? Well, what it means is somebody's gone back and is actually doing productive work, growing food. And they're doing that on a part-time basis. And they're making just enough to get by. And then they have the other half of their time is devoted to whatever interests them. and they can create value in some other way. And so this model, I call it like hybrid work. Believe it or not, there's a lot of people who are kind of pursuing this. Instead of trying to get a job with a global corporation or the government, they're finding ways to work with other people, work with their friends, maybe have a part-time gig and then start their own little business. And so this model is much more flexible, decentralized, and more self-reliant than the idea, well, I'm going to get a job and I'm going to earn a pension and then I'm going to go golfing. And if that model breaks down, then there's another way of living out there.
Well, that model has broken down for the vast majority. I still see some guys that look like they're in the corporate world with the corporate golf bag, but I think for the vast majority of them, that's gone.
Yeah, and one of my readers sent me an email with a powerful analogy. She said corporate America it treats all of its employees like little electric motors, and they run those motors as hard and as long as they can until the motor breaks down.
It's no way to lead a life, is it?
I don't think so. And again, we're going back to the idea that if you have a different concept, a different idea, a different understanding of the world, then you can free yourself from this sort of addiction and dependency that we're talking about. And so I think it does kind of start with ideas.
No, I think you're 100% on the ideas. Let me ask you one last question, though, because we could talk about, I would love to have you on again, and we'll just talk only about maybe entrepreneurism, because I think that's a terribly important subject to really dive into. And so many people can be inspired that when like-minded people are saying, hey, you don't only have to have a job for the man, you can do something yourself. That's inspiring. You know, if you could get one person to move, maybe they could get one person to move on and try something new too.
Yes, social change. That's how it happens.
Yeah. Let me give one ominous last point to address in our conversation today. And I've seen you say the defining characteristic of the Bush #2 administration, the Obama administration, is the reliance on secrecy, and not to protect national security, but to avoid accountability. And, you know, we all grew up with the idea when it was Iron Curtain time and Brezhnev and communism and all this stuff. You know, we all kind of grew up and, you know, scared that, the two sides were going to get a little crazy and drop nukes on each other. So you really couldn't say, you know, you just had to trust the system. You had to trust the people at the Pentagon. They all had it figured out, and the guys in Moscow, and it was mutually assured destruction. And we're not in that world anymore. We're not in that world anymore. And I think it's insane what's happened. And I am curious your opinion on this, but I point to the dot-com bubble coupled with 9/11 has unleashed on America, and perhaps by extension the world, the greatest amount of fear that could ever be wrought. And now this whole apparatus is it's still just keeping people in fear, but the old Soviet's not there anymore. And I just don't know if, I don't know. How do you feel about that? Obviously, you don't feel too highly about this national security nonsense being used to avoid accountability. Why don't you expand on that, though?
Well, I guess we could start by saying, what's the adult way to deal with the world at any level, you know, as an individual, household, or as a nation in terms of leadership? And what we look for in adult responses, we look for problem solving and accountability. We want somebody to deal with reality, figure out how to solve a problem, and then be accountable for whether their solution works or not. And so with secrecy, of course, the problem solving is hidden from us. We don't know what decisions were made or how they were made. And then we also don't have any accountability on whether the solution worked or not. And so we have all these secret wars and drone campaigns to kill people and all kinds of machinations around the globe. But we don't know if the problems are being made worse or they're actually being solved. And in either case, the people who are making the decisions are completely unaccountable. And so if we take this as our starting point, we end up that we don't really have a functioning democracy, because we don't have any way to know what's being done in our name. And so just electing some new president when most of the government that's actually making the decisions, what's called the deep state, is unaccountable, and they don't care who's in office. What party's in power is meaningless. And we may not have a functioning democracy. And so we go, well, what's the solution to this kind of systemic problem? Well, we have to trust the network, the decentralized network, and transparency. In other words, the solution is if there's no transparency, then we don't have either democracy or accountability. And if we don't have those two things, then I don't see how we can have a successful society or economy.
Charles, you hit the nail on the head right there. And I would challenge any listener out there in the audience. Maybe you don't like this conversation, maybe you do. But for those of you that don't like it, for those of you that think that perhaps Charles is going overboard by questioning as to whether or not we have a functioning democracy, I have a simple question for you, a simple retort. Where's he wrong? Where's he wrong? Show me where he is wrong on what he's saying. And that's the part that they can't. All they can say is somebody could say, oh, Charles and Mike, they're out there in the high weeds or something, or they're overblowing this. But what you just said is factually correct. And I love it. I love you for it. I love you for saying it. Because, people are just afraid to say anything these days.
Yeah, and that fear, as you say, is not a good place. It doesn't generate solutions. It doesn't generate trust. It doesn't generate anything positive for the society or the economy. And of course, fearmongers are hoping to benefit themselves and their circle of pals. We understand the motivation to fearmonger, but we who care about the nation have to look beyond that kind of self-interest and go, what's right for the country? And I think the answer is democracy, accountability, transparency. And the internet enables a lot more of that than we could have hoped for back in the, like you say, the Cold War of the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Charles, you bring some great wisdom. As I said at the beginning, I appreciate you taking the time today. Hey, where is the best place for people to go check you out, check your blog out, check your books out? Where can people go?
Go to of2minds.com and take a look around, and I welcome your readership.
Charles, listen, I appreciate it. Hopefully we can talk again in the future. And like I said, I think you really do a nice service, because there are some folks out there that maybe are touching on some of these topics in other forums, other writers, other authors, other economists. But I like the way you do it. You bring something very down to earth. And I just challenge people to go to your site and tell me where you're wrong. That's all where is he wrong?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to discuss these topics with you, Michael. I've really enjoyed it.
Hey, Charles, thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take, along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government, and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.